this is generally what we're going to cover. I haven't really done this whole program, so because I've added a bunch of things in the last few days. So we'll just have to see where we get. But in the first half, I'm going to talk about burial practices, especially as it applies to the West, and the rural cemetery movement, why cemeteries matter, and a little bit about what I call Monuments 101, which lets you know what to look for when you see different monuments. So, just to start, I concentrate mostly on European burial practices, but burial practices around the world and across cultures have a lot of similarities. They are similar in that they do monuments of some sort. They're frequently sacred places where the dead are, and even things like facing east, which is common European, is also common in Asia and other cultures as well, so that you're facing the rising sun and ready to be resurrected, or who knows what. But even cross-culturally and across different religions, it's very common that bodies are placed facing east in rows, like you see here. Anyway, the European burial practices pretty much were to be buried in the churchyard, and so those were called graveyards, not cemeteries, generally speaking. They were the graveyards of the cemetery. And how that came about was they ran out of room to bury people under the floor, which is where they were burying them. And if you were very well-to-do or high up in the church, you would get to be buried in the floor or in the walls or something. But then they ran out of space in the floor and the walls, and so they started burying people in the yard of the church. And then when we came over, when Europeans migrated to this continent, they brought those same practices. So on the East Coast, you'll see cemeteries look a lot like this. They are also in churchyards, and they are in town because the church was in town, so they are not out in the country. Of course, in urban areas, they start having a little bit urban crowding. And not just here, but happens in Paris also. I don't know if any of you have been to Père Lachaise, but that's Lecce. Yeah, I'm not very good at French, but it's a beautiful cemetery. Here's a closer-up picture of it, but it really was the beginning of the garden cemetery. It was actually Napoleon who commissioned this, or got this started in 1804, because he thought everyone had a right to be buried regardless of race or religion, which was really quite revolutionary for the time. So it was not attached to a church. You didn't have to be attached to the church or a particular religion to be buried there. So of course it also got very crowded and no longer looked like a garden. The other thing that happens a lot in Europe is that's not a permanent spot. You're only there as long as you can keep paying for the spot. And so then they would remove the bones and put them in catacombs. So the catacombs are these underground tunnels and passageways that lead to ossuaries, and that's what this is. An ossuary is a place where you store skeletal remains. And this is an ossuary, just a little box to put some skeletal remains in, but so is this. So this is a cathedral. It's a cathedral in the Czech Republic. The Sedlec, I think, is how it's pronounced. But and if you looked that up online, it's an enormous place. all decorated with these bones. So many ways, we don't have that so much over here in this continent, but some places do have, certainly New Orleans, where they have a high water table, everyone is above ground. So either you're in a family tomb, or you're in a niche in the wall, but they're all above ground. The thing about them is they have rules there about you have to be in there a year and a day before they seal it up for a year and a day, whether it's this kind or that kind, and then they'll open it up and put somebody else in. So the bones that are in there, they push them to the back, and there's sort of a repository at the back, or sometimes they gather them all out and put them in a bag and set them to the side so they can get the new coffin in. But, and eventually they have, it gets so full that it's permanently sealed as a family unit. But they can get, 10 or 15 people in one slot because they keep pushing the bones to the back. So they are kind of an ossuary in that regard. So on top of all that came in 1831 was the rural cemetery movement. And I just have to look at a couple of my notes, but this was designed, the rural cemetery movement was just outside of Boston by Cambridge at Mount Auburn. And it was designed by Henry Dearborn and Jacob Bigelow, who was a medical doctor who was worried about the unhealthiness of these and crowding conditions in the churchyards and in the towns, that we shouldn't be burying so many people so close together in the city. So that was the start of it. It actually ended up then being the beginning of the whole public parks movement in the US. Was because they were designing these lovely garden-like places just outside of town that were open to everyone, regardless, just like with Napoleon, regardless of religion, because they were not attached to a church. However, a lot of the early cemeteries in the United States were segregated. They were for Caucasian only. They had rules, and it really wasn't until the Civil Rights Act in 1964 that it became settled that you couldn't restrict it. You couldn't restrict a cemetery to Caucasians. So for a long, long time, they were segregated. Way past the time when you had multiracial marriages, so it was, so you had families where they couldn't go together. Anyway, Mount Auburn now looks like this, more or less. It was designed like this to be a peaceful place. The idea was they were supposed to be just outside of town. Where you could commune with nature. Being closer to nature was being closer to God. They were supposed to be on a hill, a little bit shorter trip, I guess, to heaven. And so this is how they generally looked in the rural cemetery movement. It became so popular then in the 1830s, 1840s, that by the time of the Western migration, which is, after 43, 45, the West was almost all rural cemeteries. So whether it was Boot Hill in Arizona, and I'll tell you there are numerous Boot Hills across the West, not just that one, and or Lone Fir in Portland, or Salem Pioneer. If you look at any of these cemeteries, they have the same thing. They are not attached to a church. They are outside of what used to be the town. Even Lone Fir is used to be outside of Portland. And so a lot of times the city would grow and catch up to where this outside of the city cemetery was. Certainly was the case with Salem Pioneer, which is a fabulous cemetery if you have a chance to get there. Now, I don't know if did you have a presentation on Frederick Law Olmstead? I don't know. Didn't have it. Okay, well then then maybe I don't have to worry about if I make a mistake. But but Olmstead was a landscape architect. He had designed Central Park, and then he came west to work for a mining company at the tail end of the gold rush. And the company he was working for, Mariposa Mining, they went bankrupt eventually. And then he was in demand out here almost instantly for design of Yosemite Park, and then his first cemetery piece was Mountain View in Oakland. And so this was the one that he did. Of course, his sons were responsible for Portland Public Parks and Seattle Parks, and so the Olmstead name is on lots of parks, lots of cemeteries across the country. This is Mountain View now in Oakland. But that continued all on along. You have very few churchyards, or relatively few churchyard cemeteries or church graveyards in the West compared to the East Coast. Then around 1906, between 06 and 17, Forest Lawn came along. So that's in California, Glendale, and famous because lots of famous celebrities are buried there. Partly, but also it was a different way to do a cemetery. It was the beginning of the lawn cemetery, and so you see this is more the look of a rural cemetery. But what they decided with the lawn cemetery was that all those upright stones were too macabre and grotesque, and they didn't like them, and so they outlawed them, and all the stones had to be flat. Of course, it coincided with development of lawn generally and lawn mowers, and so you had this whole different look. And the problems that it created for rural cemeteries continue to this day, which is that it put pressure on the rural cemetery to look more like a lawn cemetery, and that's very hard to do. And not put your stones at risk. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later, about what happens when you try to make a rural cemetery look like a lawn cemetery. But just for a couple of things here, why does it matter about cemeteries, and why are they important? There are really the two sides. There's the artifact side and there's the human side. And on the artifact side, these are truly irreplaceable artifacts. It is like an outdoor museum. And this little tombstone here, you can see, is just the artwork in the carvings and the lettering. All marble headstones are hand carved. The reason they were using marble was because you could carve it. So these were stone carvers who had a great deal of skill. There's like 7 different font styles there, and slants and this way and that way. Besides that relief carving, which is really fabulous, of the lamb and the willow tree. But there's what you find there is a lot of iconography, what is the meaning of that lamb, of that willow, of the shape of the stone. All these things carry symbolism, but also it is a lost craftsmanship. There are very few stonemasons who can do anything like this. All gravestones now, virtually all, are made by sandblasting. and a big monument company will have, it'll be all computer driven, and the thing goes in and it just sandblasts it away and out it comes. But this was done by hand, but in the days before they could carve, they didn't have the power or the tools to carve in granite. Other things that are important at cemeteries in terms of historic artifacts are often the fencing, the mementos or grave decorations, and the vegetation. People go to cemeteries to get heirloom varieties of all kinds of plants because they've been planted there, 150 years ago. And of course, you get to see the evolution of materials and kind of why the different materials evolved. So there's a lot that's important about cemeteries with regards to the artifacts themselves, but then there is also the human side of it. And it is important for all those who are interred to be acknowledged, to be recognized, and it doesn't matter if they were a famous person or not a famous person. It says something about the community and the culture that you respect the people who have come before. And of course, a cemetery is a place where they honor veterans, pioneers, notables of one sort and another. And the other thing I always keep in mind is respecting the wishes of the people who put those monuments there. So this monument, as you can see, says, "In memory of our beloved mother," and says at the bottom, "Goodbye, dear mother, till we meet again." And so her children did this. This was would have been an expensive stone in a little farming community, and they would have had it designed for her and carved for her. So her family went to a lot of trouble and expense to do this stone. So I always try to, in restoring things at my cemetery, I try to get back to what I think the family wanted, what their vision was. So to talk a little bit about monument materials, I have to look at my clock. Yeah, okay. Wood was one of the reasons you don't find that a lot of graves are unmarked is that originally a lot of them were wood. And in arid environments, they tend to last longer, like the one on that side. But this is Francis Revenue Cemetery in Sandy, Oregon. Very wet conditions, and it's got a whole bunch of still existing wood monuments. There's no writing anymore on them, but lots of historic cemeteries you travel to, you'll see the occasional little wood marker. Other lesser used monument materials include slate, which is very common on the East Coast, and that is a picture over there of a slate marker. But you can see it's from the 1700s. Slate was also soft enough to carve, and you'd know it was East Coast because it has the winged head, or the death head. And by the time of the Civil War, they had quit doing death heads on stones, but it's very common before that, and those stones are all on the East Coast. So I've only seen one slate stone out here on the West Coast, but I'm sure you could find them. The other two are examples of sandstone. I only found one sandstone in Clackamas County, and that's the one in the middle at Rock Creek. It's very unusual to use sandstone for the monument because it doesn't hold up well enough. Where you see sandstone all the time is this one over here, the column. It's sitting on, that's a marble stone sitting on a sandstone base. And it was very common to use a sandstone base to set marble on so that the marble wasn't in the dirt. And they would be carved like you can see, it's just lightly carved, but that's where you see sandstone all over the place here in the West. Zinc, which they called white bronze, is another one that you see not too often. But if you want to see a lot of examples of it, go to Aurora. Aurora Pioneer has a lot of zinc. Zinc was all made by the Monumental Bronze Company in Connecticut. No one ever made grave markers in zinc except them. They sent salespeople out across the country, and obviously Aurora, which was a communal town, decided the salesman apparently visited Aurora because they have a bunch of them. There is one, that is the one that is at my cemetery. But I only have that, well, I have two. I have a little one and I have that big one. And one of the things that they had was, I'll try my pointer, but I don't know if you can see. You see how these plaques that go in here, in the middle of this, they have the name. And you would add them around the column as family members passed. But during Prohibition, these are hollow, of course. It's made out of zinc. During Prohibition, people broke into them and stored liquor in there for pickup. So that's why you can see on the bottom of that one panel, it's been cut open. So they moved contraband around by stashing it inside these big hollow zinc monuments. So that's the history of zinc. Zinc fell out of favor after, well, the company was taken over by the government for World War I for munitions use, and then they never got going again after the war. Then I'll come to the two big ones, marble and granite. And of course, granite is what everybody uses now for obvious reasons, but this is marble. When you go to the average cemetery, you'll see all these marble stones, and they will look like that one I showed you with the sandstone base, dark gray. They look all dark gray. They were not dark gray. Once they are cleaned, you'll see they vary from bright white to dark gray to medium gray to lots of marbling, dark with light marbling, light with dark marbling. There's just a large variety, but you don't see that until you clean them. And so these are in my cemetery, Pleasant View, which is between Wilsonville and Sherwood, because I've cleaned them. All of the Arlington, certainly the Civil War, that's a government issue stone, and they're all bright white marble. And the marble, like I said, was carved by skilled craftsmen. A lot of them have statuary as a part of them. Lambs, of course, were usually with infants. But beautiful examples, both of the carving and the marble, can be found in lots of cemeteries. And you see, like the little lamb one, that's a sandstone base that it's sitting on. They didn't want the marble to be in the dirt because marble is a very porous stone and it will stain with the soil colors. Really simple ones. This is the father one is a small auxiliary stone. There'll be a father and a mother stone. And then there's granite. Granite came into use around 1910, 1915. By the end of the teens, by 18 even, you weren't seeing marble anymore. There's just a very stark divider line there when they had power. I don't know how they initially used power for it, but steam power or some kind of power to be able to carve granite. And once they did, everyone moved to granite because it lasts forever. It's a very, very hard stone. And it comes in many colors. Now, when you see these in a cemetery, a granite marker, if it's before 1910, if the death date is before 1910, you know that this is a replacement marker, or it went up when the second of the couple died. So the one on the end, the Joneses, the second person dies in 1910. That's really early to have a monument that big in granite. But I suppose it would be possible, but it's more likely that was a replacement stone. They had a stone, and sometime after he passed, the family decided, well, we're going to do a really nice one because the mother had died in 1893. We know they didn't have granite then. And similar for both the other ones. But anyway, here's granite. It comes in these colors, all the rose-colored colors, light and dark. This is an unusual one in that, oh, I forgot to say, granite is almost always sitting on another piece of granite. So all those gray bases are lower grade granite. And so they hold up very well. And sometimes the granite is sitting on cement, but sometimes it's not, the granite base. This one is unusual because it's a big granite marker, and the second date, well, obviously a replacement, because they didn't have granite in 1900. But it's sitting on sandstone, and you can see what's happening to the sandstone. It's all falling apart. It's starting to ball and come apart. The one corner is hanging out in the air. This is a base that needs to be replaced in the next 5 or 10 years because eventually that stone will fall off of there. And that's not good. So, but I'll show you some others later. Other examples of granite, and of course these are upright granite, all sitting on a piece of granite, not on sandstone. And I think part of it is the weight. Granite is so heavy that it's just too heavy for sandstone. There's other colors that it comes in. They're just everywhere, including the little ones. So there's lots of little pieces of granite, big pieces of granite. They are pretty impervious to rain and sun and whatever. So they are the stone of choice now, and probably will be for a long time, because there's a recent one. The most common stone in cemeteries is going to be a piece of granite surrounded by concrete. It's going to look similar to that. And be flat, especially if it's a lawn cemetery where they don't allow uprights. I would have to take a moment to mention footstones, because if you're in cemeteries, you'll run into footstones. In most of the 1800s, they had people had a headstone and a footstone, and the footstone was at the foot of the grave, which put it kind of in the middle of the aisleway, which didn't matter when you didn't have lawnmowers, but they don't work with lawnmowers. So they usually just had initials on them, or a first name, or they would say baby or something like that. But because the detailed information was on the headstone. What we've done, now Salem Pioneer, when I was talking to them, they are trying to put their footstones, or they were, back at the foot. But a lot of the footstones have been lost or tossed over the years. When I find them, I put them in the row with the headstone, with the headstone they go with. just so we don't lose them, and they're not in the way of the mowers, but it's something to look for. Don't be confused that that's a headstone or a really tiny headstone. It's a footstone. And then I'll mention a few things about iconography, because when are we stopping? 10 after, yeah. Iconography is a whole field that people write whole books on, and the symbolism in cemeteries and everything here. I can't begin to. I could do a 4-hour presentation on iconography if I knew to do it, but or did the research for them, but. Especially in the West. In the East, you had, for a couple hundred years, you had various versions of the skull and crossbones, or the winged head or winged skull, and things were pretty consistent. That's what people had on their headstones. But by the time of the rural cemetery movement, people were trying to make things prettier than that. And so you see these other elements coming in. Usually, like I said, lambs are reserved for infants and young children. Doves are frequently attached, could be on anyone's, but commonly on young women. The broken flower or anything that's broken, it usually means that it was someone who met an untimely death, or that sort of thing. The urn is a common symbol on stones that is supposed to mean eternity. What was I going to say about this? Oh, so here is a stone in my cemetery the way I found it a few years ago. And I want to mention this because if you're really interested in iconography, you need to join up with the Association of Gravestone Studies. And they had their national convention here at Willamette University a few years ago, and I attended it. These people know symbolism, and not only that, they know the carvers. And they can recognize the carver by name, from across the cemetery and say, oh, there's whatever his name is, who carved that one. Anyway, this is a stone I found in this condition. The base was underground. That's what you see sticking there in the grass. And the top of it, obviously, it's a white tablet. It's a big white tablet, like this tall, that was broken by vandals and had been down, and then someone had stuck it up in the ground like that. So we resurrected it, and here's what it looks like now. It is repaired and cleaned, and the repair is what you call a sacrificial joint. So that means it's a weak union. So if someone tried to push it over or break it again, it should break at that crack. So the notion is to make a weak repair that will break there. If a tree hit it, if a grave digging machine backed into it, it'll break at that same spot, not a new spot. But once we got that base up out of the ground, there's what we found: the name of the carver. And it's pretty rare. I have maybe 3. I have a cemetery with about 2,000 markers. I've only got 3 that I have found a carver's initial or a carver's name on it. But the Association for Gravestone Studies are always looking for these that have that recognize the carver. And what else was I going to say about this? Then one other icon I will mention here are curtains. And curtains are very common, and they appear in many fashions. This one over here, the Zumwalt one, it has actual real curtains on a curtain rod with curtain rings. That's about as clearly a curtain as you can come up with. The other two are modified curtains or symbolic curtains. And you'll see that with ivy sometime going around. It's a curtain or an entry into beyond the veil or into the next realm. So this one has all those symbols. It has the gates, or you're going through the gates of heaven, which is another common symbol, and the ivy going around it, and of course the mansions. And not to leave the mansions undescribed, they say, "In my Father's house are many mansions." So, but all of those are things you see in one way and another in many stones. You don't usually see them all piled up in one stone. But, and as time went on, they became more symbolic to describe kind of the same thing. And then there's insignias. This is what in my cemetery also, but I have never seen a more beautiful GAR symbol. This is the Grand Army of the Republic of the Union Civil War soldiers. It's a lovely icon or insignia. And but here's another one. This is from obviously a replacement stone, but it's it's an insignia for the Indian Wars, someone who was a veteran. And the last thing I'll say, and we'll take a break for questions, is about mementos. These are called mementos or grave decorations. And I think that, and they're very common in historic or rural cemeteries. They are generally not allowed in lawn cemeteries. And I think that is unfortunate for mourners, but I think also, I thought it was unfortunate when Metro, who took over 14 cemeteries from Multnomah County that were historic cemeteries, they made a rule that you couldn't leave any mementos in any of their cemeteries. Well, these were rural cemeteries that were designed for, anyway. We try to be very respectful. This is another thing that varies a lot cross-culturally, but you see a lot of commonalities. Seashells are a Christian memento symbol. Coins, a bottle of beer or booze, sometimes half-drunken, and and the other half left for the loved one. But especially children who have passed, people want to leave toys at different times of the year. And so we try to be respectful of that. Certainly the Latino culture has a big celebration in that regard with the Day of the Dead, where you're supposed to be bringing mementos for those who have passed. So this is a whole nother area of study, and there are books written just on grave mementos. So. With that, I'll pause because my time says I'm supposed to pause and ask if you have questions to this point. Oh, now, she's going around with
Hi, this is Priscilla.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, there must be different procedures and rules for allowing burials in certain cemeteries. For instance, in the Xena Church one, which is in Spring Valley, you have to have a reason why you want to be buried there. And so you have to be interviewed by the board, and you have to write.
I hope before you're dead.
Oh, yes. And you have to write an essay why you want to be buried there in something about it. So I don't know, are there other rules for other cemeteries?
Well, cemeteries, the management of cemeteries varies all over the place. Some of them are owned by governments, like parks. Multnomah County offloaded all of theirs onto Metro, the regional government, because they didn't want to take care of them. And mine is a nonprofit, private nonprofit, whose membership, in theory, is made up of all of the descendants of the people buried there. Well, how do I know? Half of you might be descended from people in my cemetery. So it's pretty loose. Some of them are owned by churches, and they all make their own rules, is the long and the short of it. A lot of historic cemeteries are what they call no longer active, which means they're not taking burials, or some of them, Kanema is one in Oregon City, where they only take cremains because there's not enough room for casket burial. So, and at some point, every cemetery runs out of room, I guess, but I see what they do in Europe, so I guess we're not quite there. And then they'll close it and say they're not accepting any more burials. So it just depends. I know by law you can restrict it, like if it's an Oddfellows cemetery, to people who are associated with the Oddfellows or descendants of the Oddfellows or something. And you certainly can require that the Jewish cemetery only has members of the Jewish faith in it. But you can't restrict by race anymore. So some of those rules don't stand up to law.
Hi, I'm Stephen Moe. Could you tell me, I've seen some humorous sort of things that have been put on gravestones. Do they have restrictions on those? For instance, just to give an example, on the gravestone it said, "I told you I was sick."
Yeah, right. Yeah, there are whole books on epitaphs. So that's what those are called, is epitaphs, and but there really aren't, and so it's because we don't approve the stone before it goes in. That's up to the family. I don't know what we would do if someone put something on a stone that was obscene or, otherwise, I don't know, because we don't approve it. You get to write whatever you want for your loved one. And so some of them are intentionally humorous, and certainly the little symbols that go on. Now, if you go to a monument store, you can have, everything from a fish to a hummingbird to any hobby you could think up. They will have a symbol for that, and so there's, and if you want to pay someone to draw you a special picture, and they can make a photograph, essentially with laser cut you into the granite, if you want the photograph of your loved one. So, yeah, there's no restrictions that I know of at this point.
Well, your last comment just answered my question. I've noticed recently here in the Browning Avenue Cemetery here in South Salem, a lot more photographs. And do you know when that started? Is that just in the last 10 years, or?
It seems to me, well, it's again a little bit of a cultural thing. It's more common in the Russian community to have photographs. In the Greek community, and they had, and perhaps still use, a plastic photo thing that is stuck on. But now they can laser cut you right into the granite. So, and that's probably going to last longer. But some of those stick-on pictures last 5 or 10 years anyway, have. So I don't know, but it varies. You see them, some cemeteries and some sections, Lone Fir in the Greek section, there's all, black stones with photos.
And then I just wanted to mention a humorous one in our family. My godmother wrote Walt to her husband, who outlived her. I was hoping you'd stop by.
This is Janet up here on your right. And I was wondering, a couple of the headstones you showed had a handshake. And I was wondering if that was a lodge or fraternal order symbol.
No, and there's a bunch of interpretations of the clasping hands. And the one I can't really figure out is about the fingers. And as well as some will be a picture of a finger pointing up, a finger pointing down. There'll be clasping hands with one finger pointing down like this, and some of them the finger is still here. Frequently, it's obviously a male hand and a female hand. But generally, people, what I've read is it is either a farewell to my loved ones because I'm going to heaven, or it's till we meet again kind of thing. Or sometimes it has to do with God, or someone is reaching down for your hand, and you're going up to heaven with somebody, and the same with the up is of course I went that way, and the down, I don't know what that one means. If it's I don't know how they interpret those, but there's lots of hands that show up on graves.
Hi, I'm Sally Hopkins, but I just wanted to tell you, I happen to be from Dodge City, Kansas.
Oh.
And Dodge City has the original Boot Hill.
Okay.
And I wanted to tell you that place in Arizona is kaboot.
Oh. Okay. I'll see if I can find a picture of it.
This is Charlene. You mentioned closing cemeteries.
Yeah.
Are there any rules about upkeep after it's closed?
No, there aren't. It depends on who owns the cemetery, but there are abandoned cemeteries all over. And I'm going to be doing a presentation for Clackamas County and talk a lot about theirs. There are 14 or 15 abandoned cemeteries in Clackamas County that have no one looking after them. And so they fall into disrepair pretty quickly. And it really is unfortunate. Unless you have a cemetery district, which some counties have one, I think, or Lincoln County in Oregon has an official position that they take over care of any abandoned cemeteries. But the other counties refuse to.
Yes, this is Frank.
Oh,
Franca, I'm first.
I'll get used to going like this and this.
Hi, I'm Joel over here.
Yeah.
I have to admit that I love cemeteries, and it's a family joke that when we travel, I'll slam on the brakes to back up to go into a cemetery and check it out. But anyway, when we took the tour of the New Orleans cemetery, they explained how they take the pole and shove back after a year and a day whatever has remained. That thing that they're in functions as a crematorium because the weather is so hot, the sun comes down, they're actually cremated. And then that's where in comes the expression, I wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole, because they're using a 10-foot pole for that.
To the back, yeah. Yeah, I had heard it gets up to 300 or more degrees in inside those.
And I missed in your introduction, apparently, what do you mean by my cemetery?
Oh, I'm president of the Pleasant View Cemetery Association, and I should have said that, but Pleasant View is a cemetery between Wilsonville and Sherwood on a hill outside of town that has about 3,000 burials. And it's, like I said, it's a private nonprofit, but the membership is undefined. Shall we say?
So I have a question. Well, you actually introduced my question. It's about I'm sorry, my name is Franca, and I'm a passionate hobbyist on pioneer cemeteries. I've visited quite a few of them. But anyway, I've noticed that the cemeteries, a lot of them are on hills or inclines, And I always, not all of them, but I always presumed that they were because it was the good, easy agricultural land, and they didn't bother with the hills, so that's where they put the
And
the graveyard.
that certainly would weigh in on it. I think they chose hills for a number of reasons, and that is one of them. Some are right down in the flat of the valley, because there's no hills nearby. But usually they were looking for a hill. But a lot of cemeteries start as a family plot. Remember, they had 640 acres, so it was pretty far to go from your place to the neighbor's place. And so someone would die, they would be buried out back in the family plot. And then it just gradually would become a community cemetery, because everybody didn't want to have a cemetery. And I've already got 3 people in mind, so you're welcome to come over too. We'll all get together on that. And then eventually it gets, that's the history of mine. It was a family cemetery, became a community cemetery, and then a few years later the family donated it to the Pleasant View Cemetery Association, became officially a community cemetery.
My name is David. I used to navigate ships across the ocean. We actually stopped the ship in the middle of the ocean once and dumped a guy's ashes into the ocean because that was his preferred way to go.
Yeah. Yes, and that is true. And one of the things you'll see on the coast, if you go to cemeteries in Astoria or wherever, are cenotaphs, which I was going to talk about, but now I'll talk about it. Cenotaphs are grave markers where the guy isn't there, or gal. They're not there. So on the coast, you see a number in the cemetery of gravestone that says lost at sea. So they are not there, whether they intentionally were buried at sea or they were lost at sea, which is the case in a lot of at Astoria.
Hi, Jinx back here in the back. I've noticed that often Catholic cemeteries are separate. Is that the choice of the Catholics? Were they discriminated against? Is that just a Western kind of thing? And is it still happening?
I think it's a choice of the Catholics. St. Paul, Oregon, has the oldest cemetery rectory in Oregon. And it had a graveyard there. And, most cemeteries, historic cemeteries, the people buried there, the older burials, are people who died within about a 5 or 10 mile radius. St. Paul, however, has Catholics buried in there who came all the way from Milwaukee or Portland or, far away, Canada, who wanted to be buried in the St. Paul Cemetery because of its Catholic roots. So some of it is the individuals who go out of their way, but sometimes it is set aside. The Jewish cemetery is just for Jewish faith or whatever. So it could be either way.
My name is Don, and I'm from near Niagara Falls, U.S. side. And great-great-grandfather is buried just outside the church where I grew up, 1763. So I'm guessing that started as a church cemetery, and now it goes quite a long ways, like a half mile from there. And it's a small hill. And my family comes from Alsace, and before that, the Black Forest. I wanted to ask if these are all granite that you have in the picture?
Yep, these are all granite.
And the other place I've lived is Durango, Colorado, and I do a lot of hiking. And I discovered an abandoned cemetery there with sagebrush growing around and still some wooden markers from 100 years ago.
Yeah.
Because that's when the Durango and Silverton Railway got started, about 100 years ago. So, thank you.
Yes. No, it's always interesting.
This is Bob. To follow up on what Franca said, we noticed a lot of times traveling back east that, I guess, ironically, some of the fiercest fiercest battles of both the Revolution and the Civil War took place in cemeteries, because, like at Brandywine, for example. And I guess there are a lot of stone walls and things to hide behind while you kill someone else.
Yes, yes, I'm sure that would be the case. You had good open line of sight, but there was something to stand behind that was a stone. Yeah, yeah.
Good morning. My name's Eric. I have a comment, not a question. As you mentioned, we are talking about the base of some of these granite memorials. There is quite a difference in the quality and hardness of various granites. One of my good clients for years when I was practicing law in Pennsylvania was Rock of Ages, that's headquartered in Barry, Vermont.
Right.
And we had a case several years ago against an unscrupulous dealer just outside of Pittsburgh that was a Rock of Ages dealer until he was terminated, who was buying Georgia granite, sandblasting the Rock of Ages seal mark, which is a perpetual warranty on the memorial, selling it as a Rock of Ages memorial. Rock of Ages found out about it because they began to get complaints about memorials that were fading or cracking. And we eventually got that stopped.
Huh. Yeah, there are different levels of granite, certainly. Georgia gray is probably the least expensive gray granite, and probably these are, my monument guy that works with me at the cemetery, he can name every color and say that's such and such rose and that's Georgia gray and that's whatever, but they're recognizable.
This is.
Yeah. Well, I guess I can pull it out here pretty far. I'm just used to a little more movement. But okay, well, we will resume. So I'm going to talk about historic cemetery care. Someone asked about cleaning. Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, maybe this will be easier. I won't be quite so restricted. And then location, because location is always important. I always tell people people are not buried alphabetically, and they are not buried randomly. So how they are buried in a plot is really important, tells you a lot about it. And so we'll talk a little bit about that, and then about unmarked graves. And then I have a 3-minute ballad at the end where I do not sing. Anyway, this is kind of a list of the timeless threats and the modern threats of cemeteries. Of course, on the left side, the things we always have to deal with in an outdoor environment. The rain. Rain is falling at 35 miles an hour every single drop. And every time it hits a piece of marble, it's going to be taking material. And of course the sun, the wide ranges of temperatures, animals, everything from bugs and cocoons and butterflies that want to nest on stuff to moles and voles and gophers, who are always a problem in a cemetery, to deer who want to scratch on the on the things. Natural disasters, just the way the earth shifts, all of those things will wear things down in a cemetery. The modern threats, however, have kind of expanded on that. Mostly they have to do with trying to be a lawn cemetery when you are not. Because they have brought in mowers and string trimmers, and the equipment to bring those in brings in high velocity equipment that throws things or can throw things, and especially marble, but even granite can be chipped by flying debris. Irrigation is a problem. Fertilizers, pesticides, cars are coming in more than they did obviously in the 1800s. And then there are well-intentioned but not very good repairs. So this is hard to tell, but this is an example of irrigation damage. And the one on the left is granite, the other one is marble. The trouble with irrigating in a cemetery is that they almost always are using a well, a groundwater well, and it almost always has iron and calcium and all kinds of things that will deposit on the stone. You could clean that off the granite one. You probably will never get iron deposits off of the marble one, certainly not without removing marble material. So I'm chair of the Oregon Historic Cemetery Commission, and we just did a position paper advising against irrigation in historic cemeteries because of this. One of the worst ones is Belpassi in Woodburn. I think this one I think is yep. The Jackson one is that this is a zinc monument. They're usually a very light gray. That's in Belpassi, and they're aerial spraying with these big gun things, and it's just amazing that they do that. The other damage they can do is to the sandstone bases, because that sandstone is very fragile. Now, I don't know if this was from irrigation or the rain or it was a bad piece of sandstone. The other thing that sandstone is vulnerable to are string trimmers. And there's hardly a cemetery you can go in with marble on top of sandstone that the corners are not chewed up by string trimmers. So we're very careful in our cemetery to train the string trimmer users that we're going to go straight across one edge of the sandstone, then we're going to walk over here, go straight across here, and walk over there. We're not coming around the corner with the string trimmer on the corner of that, and we don't want them to touch we don't care if there's a little grass left, don't touch the sandstone with the string trimmer. These are big monuments, and they're going to fall pretty soon if they haven't already, because I took these a couple years ago. So these are very dangerous to have in a cemetery in that state, because it could kill a person if it fell on them. Then another issue with care is when marble is down. This is a picture of a stone that is upright, and here's one that fell over and they left it down. These are from the same time period. Actually, that one is older than this one, and they're in the same cemetery. But those raindrops are doing a number on this guy, and over here they're sheeting down it, and this one they're violently hitting it, and it doesn't have a chance to drain away. So you see, it will pool in the carving areas, and then stain. And not only stain it, but also allow lichen to grow more readily from the moisture. Here's a close-up of that one and a close-up of this one. So, so we did try to get all of our marble that was upright in our cemetery one way or another, because of trying to protect it from that situation. The other thing that happens when marble tablets go down is the sod is very aggressive on the west side of the Cascades, and just like it will cover over your sidewalk if you don't keep trimming it back, it will cover over that flat tablet and it will disappear. It's also very vulnerable to equipment running over it, and it's likely to get broken, which this one did. And here's one, this one, Little Norwood over here, is in my cemetery. And that's the way I found him when I started restoring my cemetery, Pleasant View, about 10 or 12 years ago that I started working in earnest on it. But here's what we did with Norwood. So he's now upright. We could not find all the pieces because the upper part had been driven over so many times by mowing equipment that it was badly broken, but we pieced it together what we could find. I never found that last little piece at the top, but But we did find the whole base, which was underground. So it's on its original base. Here's an example of when repairs go wrong. Like I said before, the goal is always sacrificial repairs so that it won't break in the same place. It won't break in a new place or cause, if it's going to break, it's not going to cause even more damage. In this case, you can see, I hope you can see, this is a crack running vertical, and it is down here and it is over here. That's because it's pinned. Someone took those two pieces, drilled holes, and put metal pins in there. They're sitting on pins. And you can see the slightest pressure on this stone, and it's going to blow out the back of the stone. That whole piece is going to come apart. So they tried to do what was best and they thought would last, but it doesn't. It makes the next vandalism or deer pushing against it or tree branch falling on it will completely wreck this stone, and it will be very hard to repair after that. So you see that a lot where you have. Here's another case. This is a common one in lots of cemeteries. The two white tablets were perhaps broken, certainly pushed over, and the family decided they would cut them off so that they're this nice length, because usually it's got a long piece of the blank piece that's in the ground, but and put them in cement. And next to it, the gray one on the side, that's a tall obelisk. And right here is the plinth. That should be sitting on top of that plinth. So both of these, both this one and that one, are as big around on all sides as they are on the front side. It's a square unit. Now, putting it in cement like this, and the family had the best of intentions here, but I have recently cleaned these, but you can see I can't really get them clean because they're stained from the water pooling in there, the ones with the relief carvings. The others, we can't ever know what's on the other side of that obelisk. So it's a shame. This is one. This is I have two of this family's descendants are on my board of directors, and it was their aunt or great aunt who did this. But we are thinking about taking these out and seeing if we could get them released from this cement. But a lot of them you can't. You'll do more damage getting them out. So you're kind of stuck. Cleaning. So there's marble cleaning and there's granite cleaning. That's all I'll talk about because that's 90% of the stones you're going to see in this part of the world. Roston here looked like almost all marble looks in almost every cemetery you go to. It looked like that. You could kind of make it out if you got up close. But one of the things it did when you leave marble looking like that is then people go up and they want to take rubbings and other things that you really don't want people touching marble. It's just too fragile of a stone. This is cleaned with D2, so there was never a cleaner on it. D2 is a biocide for lichen. It doesn't, as you can see, even kill plants or affect the plants that are growing around it. It's just for lichen, and it is very effective. Slow, but effective. It is what they use in Arlington. It's what they use on the Washington Monument, the White House, and everything else in Washington, D.C. that National Parks is taking care of that is marble. And after you clean it, it looks like the one in the middle, I say clean it, but cleaned it with, I could go through how I clean it with D2, but then 6 months later you come back and it looks like this. And so it's amazing the difference when a cemetery, it took me a couple of years to make it all the way through my cemetery on the marble. I forget how many I have. I have about 100, I think, marble guys, but that's how D2 is. I have it posted at my cemetery that I don't really want anyone else cleaning the marble, unless the sign says unless you've been trained in care of historic marble, leave that to me, or come and see me and I'll show you how it's done, and or we can talk about it if you think there's a problem with a stone there. But I'm very protective of the marble. You certainly don't want to use soaps or bleaches or anything like that on marble. It's like I say, it's I only would be using D2 because I went to, at Niagara Falls, I went to the National Park Service a cemetery conference to learn about stuff like this, and that's where I got that. Here's granite before and after, and granite can benefit from D2, but you don't really need to use it. You can use just about anything to clean granite, soap and water and a scrub brush, and they will clean right up with elbow grease. But and this is immediately after. You know, you don't have to wait. It's kind of a waste of the expense of D2 to clean granite with it, but it still makes a big difference in a cemetery as a whole when you can drive through and read this name from way away. Otherwise, you have no idea till you get right up on it what that is. So let's talk about cemetery mapping, because this is what's interesting. Here is a section out of my cemetery. It is, I have 12 sections, more or less the size of this. All those yellow plots are unmarked graves. So if you were looking at this section, you would just see green grass and one marker down there. So, but because I have ledgers, I know that I have really quite good ledgers. I know those people are there. I don't know exactly where they are, but I know they're in this plot. Now, these other ones in the older part of the cemetery might have someone in them, or they might not. But I also am a grave dowser. I don't know if you're familiar with dowsing, but I can tell you that a lot of those are occupied. There's somebody in them, but they didn't get into the ledger books. And that was true because who were they going to call? They didn't have a phone. And the people just didn't think to, and they buried people very quickly because they were laying out in the living room. And so they usually wanted to bury them within a day or two. And so you didn't get, they never got around to telling the sexton at the cemetery that somebody went in. And that happened a lot. But because I have some beautiful big monuments that didn't get into the ledger either for some reason. And I have better ledgers than most old cemeteries do. But I want to show you a separate one, and we'll just look at one line here of kind of what goes on. But on my cemetery website, you can click on any of these names, and it will bring up the detail about that person. And wait a second. I must have turned it off by mistake. Moved. Oh, hello? It died? Oh, no, no battery. Okay, well, I'll go back to the old thing. You might need it. Uh-oh, broke it. I can't remember where I was. Let's just look at this one row. We'll look at this one row here. They are, and I'll, when you're at a cemetery, one of the things that's good to know is how they were sold, but mostly they were sold in lots. They were sold either a full lot or a half lot, which was 6 or 12, and occasionally people bought a single plot, but that was less common. And if you look at these names, you can guess that they're probably all related. Without knowing it's a family plot, you can see that if the same name has appeared a couple of times outside of, in other words, there's a Kaiser at one end, there's a Kaiser at the other end. In the middle, people are named Case. You know they're all related because the Cases would not have made it into, they would not have made it into the family plot if they were not a member of the family. Now, the interesting thing about this is that Abby down there at the end in the yellow one is unmarked. Everybody else has a marker, but somehow she didn't get one. And you can see, well, I'll pull them up. Here's my ledger. These are like gold. If a cemetery has them, they need to protect them. Ours are in a bank vault, but I have digitized them so that we can look at them. But you can't read these, but there's Calvin Kaiser up here. Here's Calvin, and here's his wife, Abby. He dies a whole bunch of time before her. He dies in 06. She doesn't die for 30 years. She dies in 1936. So when Calvin dies, his wife, Abby, and I presume his children, get him this fabulous stone. It really is a marvelous stone with the mansions and all that. He also gets a government issue Civil War stone, so he's set. And then what happened? Who dies next in there? Vita Delilah Case. Well, for a long time there's just Calvin and Vita, and you don't know how she's related, but you'll see this a lot. Babies are frequently buried with their grandparents. In this case, she's a great-grandchild of Calvin, but they're there for a long time. It's not until 1934 his son dies, the grandfather of Vita, and then Abby dies in 36. Well, now her husband is gone, her son is gone, and no one gets around to doing a stone for her. These are double stones, husband and wife stones. The parents of Vita, who don't die until 64 and 78. So, so that's you can kind of figure out what happened, perhaps, why one spouse gets a fabulous monument and the other one gets nothing. But that's not uncommon. Now, I just want to mention one other thing that I call this love beyond memory, because Vita Delilah had a brother named Floyd, who was a younger brother of her, and she dies as a 2-year-old. So I don't even know if anyway. Floyd came down, he lived up in Chehalis or somewhere in Washington, comes down every Memorial Day. This was before I cleaned her up, but puts these flowers, obviously out of his garden, in these cans that he brought. He's 85 years old and trekking down here to put flowers on a sister that he never knew. So it really is touching, the kind of things that you see going on in a cemetery. Other grandparent things that I didn't have time to do very much. Richard Gray was a mystery to me for a long time. He's next to a beautiful big, you already saw it, the Hugh Jones stone. It took me a long time to figure out. I suspected it's a baby, and why is he, who does he belong to? I have no one else in the whole cemetery named Gray. Vita Delilah, it was easy to figure her out, at least by the time her parents and grandparents died. But Richard Gray, here's what happened with him. He marries, his mother married someone, has him, then gets divorced, and after the baby dies, and she remarries somebody else. Obviously, the father disappeared, whoever she divorced, and she's buried in another part of the cemetery under a different name, under I think Anderson or something, whole different part of the cemetery with another guy, and Gray never appears again. The name Gray doesn't appear anywhere in my cemetery. So, but I would always be suspicious when an infant appears in a family plot. They're probably a grandchild or a great-grandchild. This is another one. Here's one that I resurrected because it was in the ground and in a bad state. You couldn't read the thing. Edna, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. A.J. Bell. And here she is once I got the stone cleaned and repositioned, and you can see the dates. And she's, sure enough, right next to A.J. Bell. So you think this is the daughter of A.J. Bell, but look at the dates. And he died in 1888. She was born in 1903. So it's clearly not his baby. It's again, she's the granddaughter of this A.J. Bell, and she's the daughter of his son, another A.J. Bell. So that's another thing to look out for. The Westfalls are another case of many missing stones. So this is a case where there is a curbing around the family plot, where which you see sometimes families will put a concrete curbing around their plot. There's no markers, but 2 markers, and one of them is a Westfall. I am pretty sure he belongs there, but his stone was left at my front gate of the cemetery. So I presume it was stolen at some point, and decades later someone was hit with a pang of conscience, or they found it in their garage. I don't know, but he ended up back at my gate, and my cemetery is on Westfall Road, so it was a good guess. And the other one is this one. I don't know why all the Westfalls. I do have quite a few Westfalls listed in the ledgers who are buried there. But the other monument, the only monument that I really know was there, is Granville Ryder. And he's not even named Westfall. And I have to tell you how curious this is. His wife, who was a Westfall, died after they'd been married for like 50 years, over 50 years. His wife died. He was waiting he was supposed to go meet his family at the train station with the casket to go to the service, and he missed the train. The family, 2 trains, 3 trains come, and then the family went out to see what was the matter, and sure enough, Granville was dead back at his house, and they've got the casket of Mrs. Ryder. But so they put the service off until the next day, had a double service for these 2, and it made a big deal in the paper. that they were, couldn't bear to be apart, and then he ends up with a marker, and she ends up with nothing. I'm mystified. I don't know what happened there. Apparently, the Westfalls, maybe the writers in the Westfalls didn't get along, but you would think, given this extremely romantic story, that someone would have put both their names on the stone. But there you go. Now, in missing markers, let me see what I have to see when we have to be done. Oh. We got time. I don't have to go so fast. Missing markers. I would say in historic cemeteries, at least 10% are missing, sometimes more than that, 20% or more. Sometimes they're all missing because the cemetery has been destroyed. But in your average cemetery where people are trying to take care of it, at least 10% of the markers are gone, or they never got one. Here are two of my oldest, obviously born in the 1700s, and they don't have a marker. The Baker family is trying to get enough descendants together to do a marker for them, but we put these temporary markers up just to connect them. But here you see where it says father of Endymion, Henry, Permelia, Williamson, Moses, Melinda, and Terry. A lot of children. They're all buried there. They're all buried there, lived to be adults, and they all have markers. Why didn't they get their parents a marker? Now, none of them thought about this before they were all gone. I don't know. But anyway, it's a mystery why they don't have them. Now, maybe they had wooden markers or some other kind of marker that deteriorated and is gone. I go around and probe if I think it was a marble one that fell over and maybe it's under the ground, but I haven't come up with anything for them. Here's another case with an obelisk, which has 4 sides. You could easily put so on the one side is his wife, on the other side is his son, and they are both unmarked. I don't know why you wouldn't have put her name on the facet on her side and the son's name on the other side. They just never got around to engraving it, I guess. So we're also talking with them. Here is an interesting one for anyone who does genealogy. This is a mistake on the original marker. I found the little marker for Roland in the woods, back where they threw compost and stuff. When we were clearing that out, I find this little marker. I'm so pleased because all he had was this with no dates on it. That's what was in the place where he was. And so I bring this down and reset it, and then I'm doing the study on the census and discover that the 1880 census is done in February, and it has Roland. Roland is there as an newborn, and then in the margin, on the original census thing, in the margin, there's a note that says died. So between the time that the census taker took the census, and the time he submitted it, the infant had died by March. So somehow or another, so he was born and died in 1880, not 1881, and I'm guessing that's why someone threw it away, tried to throw it away, but it's very hard to throw these things away. They will always come home again. And so it's still there. I have thought about donating it to it's a beautiful example of carving and the lettering on it. Donating it to like the Clackamas County Museum as an example of even things that are carved in stone are sometimes wrong. So you know, it's always, when you're doing genealogy, you're always looking for multiple sources because some of it's right and some of it's not. We're thinking of redoing this because, as it turns out, his father, W.P., William Penn Short, was one of the longest riverboat captains on the Columbia and Willamette system, clear up into British Columbia. And this was his boat, the Bailey Gatzert, and in an unusual circumstance, where the infant is buried here with his grandparents, great-grandparents, I don't know, in that plot, all his family comes home and is in the plot with him. So W.P. and Etta and 4 other children, adult children, all end up being cremated and put in that plot with the infant. Usually it's the infant who gets left behind with great-grandpa, and the family goes off somewhere else. But in this case, the infant is here, and every single one of his family members come back and are residing with him with no marker. So now I'm working with that family to do an appropriate marker, especially since William Penn Short is a semi-famous guy and has no marker. Then there were the Japanese babies. I have in my cemetery between 1913 and 1921, 5 infants from 3 different Japanese families. I do not have anyone else with a Japanese surname. No adults, nothing. Just these 5 babies over that time period. And I have no other evidence of Japanese settlement in the Wilsonville-Sherwood area. So we're trying to work with our sister city, Kitakata, Japan, to come up with markers for these babies because they are a historical piece, because they were clearly there were Japanese families living there very early. So I don't know why they didn't get markers either. Our veterans, I had a scout project so that all our veterans did get at least these little markers. They're not the best, but you know, when scouts are doing a project, it's kind of hard to be too critical. And it means that I have all my veterans marked so they can get a flag, because if it's just a piece of grass, you can't really put a flag for them at Memorial Day. So that took care of that. But why are we missing markers? Well, like I said, the wood ones deteriorate and fall away. The marble falls over, and these are not in my cemetery, or I would have put them up. And but also family cemeteries. This one, gosh, I'm forgetting the name of this one, but is in Clackamas County, out in the middle of a big farm field. And someone did put a little fence around the grave markers, but myself and another grave douser were there, and it's clear there's people buried way beyond that little fence. And almost always in these old cemeteries, if there's a fence, there's probably people outside the fence. And but now it's part of the farm field. The other picture with the heavy equipment is the cemetery in Molalla, which has been encroached upon by apartment buildings, and I'm pretty sure they're in dangerous territory there also. The Gear Cemetery, this is the Gear family of our first native-born governor was T.T. Gear. This is at Ladd Hill Road and Wilsonville Road, and there's probably 150 graves here, but it's out on a prominence next to a filbert orchard, and they've been driving the equipment through the cemetery for these many years. And right, if you can see right here, is a medallion which looks like this. It's a medallion for J.C. Gear, and he's a veteran of the War of 1812, and there are only 2 or 3 of them in the state of Oregon, because that's pretty old to be getting out here. Pretty old when he traveled. Anyway, it really is a shame, the condition of this cemetery, because now there are, well, and this, since this picture was taken, has been broken. I don't know if it still exists out there. There's only 2 markers there out of those 100 or more, and equipment is still running over it all the time. Here's the situation with the Chinese. So this is next to my cemetery, and if any of you followed the situation with Metro and Lone Fir and the Chinese there that they were running into where they didn't think anyone was buried, this is an issue in other places as well. And was it Salem Pioneer is another one that was dealing with this. The Chinese labor that was here in the 1800s, you know, they only allowed men. They didn't allow women to come over, or it was pretty rare, because they were supposed to go back. They didn't want Chinese to settle here. And furthermore, the intention was when they died, they would go back to their hometown, and the hometown wanted them back because they needed their sons back to be able to be happy in the afterlife or something like that. It wasn't even so much we wanted to get rid of them. It was that they needed to go home for their ancestral to their ancestral village. So they paid insurance to the Chinese Benevolent Association, which would see to their burial and then dig up their bones and pack them in an ossuary and ship them back to China. They were buried 3 feet deep so that they would decompose quickly. And so they aren't in our cemeteries, unlike the Japanese. They aren't in the cemeteries because there was never any intention that they would stay. Or in the case of Lone Fir, they were clear off to the side, which is the case here. There's my cemetery. The Chinese are buried over here in this little forest, which of course has, you can see, has not very old trees, so it didn't used to be forested. Anyway, they were buried 3 feet deep. 5 years later, they were supposed to come, the Chinese Benevolent Association was supposed to come, dig them up. They had special boxes that were specially packed with the bones in certain order, and then sent back to China. But a lot of they were more disciplined about that happening in places like Portland and Salem than they were out in a rural area between Wilsonville and Sherwood, and other places where you had significant Chinese laborers. They often got overlooked. And I would estimate we have around 150 Chinese buried in this woods with no marker at all. Oh, okay, that's right. Anyway, so that's a whole nother thing we're trying to do, is at least get one marker to recognize this group next to ours. Here's another case where they moved a cemetery. So Meridian, this is Frog Pond Church in Wilsonville. It had a churchyard, a graveyard, and it was moved to another place in outside on a hill outside of town. But they missed a few. So as is often the case, there are a few people, I can tell from dowsing, there are 4 or 5 that are left behind. And I think that that's another case where they should put a marker that would say they're there. Or not necessarily, but say it's a sacred area because it had a cemetery.